What will happen to your consciousness, your spirit, your soul, your awareness after you die? Will it perish along with your physical body or somehow survive? That's what we're going to explore today. Welcome, everyone, to the second in a new online series of contemporary issue forum sessions. I'm Jon Nowick, a River Road member and a two-time speaker at the forum. I'm delighted to have with us today my old friend Geoff Gowen, who's going to be speaking with us. And I also want to thank for making this session possible Carl Weigel and Loretta Garcia, who are the co-hosts of the forum, as well as River Road staffers Jesse Delaplane and Anna Lim. We hope you'll also come back this time in March, on March 14th, for the next session, which is going to be with Lieutenant Kathy Estrada of Montgomery County Police. Kathy's going to speak to us about how police identify, report, and monitor hate and bias incidents in the county and the state of Maryland. So why are we having this particular session today? On a personal note, I've grown more interested in the question of what after death after hearing from a friend of mine, a hospice nurse named Verna, who I think is with us today. Verna described to me feeling the sensation of a spirit leaving the body of her patients at the moment of their death. My interest was further piqued by Geoff, who's going to speak with us. Geoff's done extensive research on the science of near-death experiences and related experiences. So this is a Unitarian Universalist forum. What do UU ministers have to say on this subject? I asked Reverend Nancy if she had any sermons on it. She sent me one, quote, "I don't technically believe in an afterlife. I think that this truth of death is ultimate, that when the brief candle goes out, it stays out. And what lives on is the way we have impacted one another and the world. I think that when it's over, it's over." But Nancy also emailed me afterwards and said, quote, "At the same time, it's terribly important to me that our people feel safe and free to reflect with me on their very different experiences and perspectives. In other words, I hold my own beliefs on such matters lightly enough to be receptive and open to the experiences of our folks," end quote. I also emailed former minister Scott Alexander, and he sent me a sermon as well. It's called, quote, "Carpe Diem, tomorrow maybe." And in it, it says, quote, "Life is to be lived, enjoyed now, in this time, right now in the midst of all these troublesome circumstances. This is it. This is the day you've been waiting for." I've become more convinced of the wisdom of what Nancy and Scott say about the importance of living for the now and having an impact on one another and on the world. And I think my friend Geoff is a great example of a man who lives for today. So let me now introduce him. Geoff Gowen. Geoff Gowen is a former member of River Road before he departed Washington, D.C. with his wife in 2000 for Flint Hill in Rappahannock County, Virginia. He's a member of UU Blue Ridge. Geoff obtained a law degree.
We're not mute.
Again, if you can all mute yourselves, that would be appreciated. We are recording the session. Thank you.
Thank you. So Geoff's a member of the UU Blue Ridge. Geoff obtained a law degree at Harvard and did graduate in economics and industrial management at MIT that led to a World Bank career. He applies his legal mind and his critical thinking skills to exploring the science of the afterlife. Geoff?
Thanks, Jon. Well, I'm delighted to be back here at River Road, at least virtually. So we're first going to get your take on the issue. I'll talk a little about what I've learned, and we're going to close with some question and answers. So hopefully we'll have time, because time's going to be our biggest enemy. So Jon's going to push to keep things going. But before we start, I wonder if I could get a show of hands. How many of you have seen the Netflix series Surviving Death? You know, just raise your physical hand. Anybody seen them? unfortunately, I'm only seeing just a few people here, but doesn't, in the group I see, it doesn't look like there's anybody that's seen it. But for those of you who have seen it, this talk will reinforce and add to some of what you saw. So I'm going to turn it back to Jon, who will conduct polling and then continue as our moderator.
Okay, so
Back to you, Jon.
I want Geoff to have a sense what we really believe about this issue before we start. So this may be a first for River Road. There's actually a poll that should have just popped up on your screens. The question in the poll, or the statement, is what is the likelihood that your consciousness will survive the death of your body? From a scale of impossible to virtually certain. Let's see where we all come out. Give it 10 more seconds.
Oh, interesting.
My, the numbers are changing. You'll all get to see the results in just a second. Okay, we're going to close the poll. And here are the results. So, hey, Geoff, it looks like a plurality of people say unlikely, and unlikely and impossible comes to 48%, but likely and virtually certain comes to 30%. And the rest of us are somewhere in the middle. Okay, how interesting. Okay, so guys, let's get a little bit more feedback from you for Geoff. What I'd like to do in a moment, I'm going to ask those of you who voted impossible or unlikely, go into the chat function at the bottom center of your computer and just type a really short, like 4 to 7 words. If you believe impossible or unlikely, why is it you believe it's impossible and unlikely? Let's tell Geoff why we don't think it's possible. You go to chat at the bottom, it should be chat everyone. And once you've typed something in, you just press your enter button or your return button. Okay, so it says brain waves stop at death, Geoff, and so does oxygen in the brain. Many things we don't know, no evidence for it. Why humans and not all animals? Oh my gosh, we'll have to have a separate session on animals. Death is the end, no afterlife. We both had experiences that convince us. Oh my goodness. Okay, interesting. Okay, I'm a neurologist who does research on EEG, MRI, and other modalities. There's no data to support this. Consciousness is a function of brain activity. When it stops, all life ends. Spirit is ineffable. Arrogant to think so. The end doesn't fit with the structure of the universe. Okay, hey, thank you guys for sharing your views. Hey, I'd now like to ask those of you who voted likely or virtually certain, that's what, 30% of you, to do the same thing. Go into chat and just type a couple of words, 4 to 7 words maybe, telling why you think that it is or might be possible that your consciousness can survive after death. One person says a personal out-of-body experience. Others say personal experiences. Any other reasons? Energy can neither be created nor destroyed, plus personal experience. Energy does not disappear, just another dimension. I watched the Netflix series and found it compelling. Jung teaches that collective unconscious. Energy persists. My dreams sometimes imply visitation. Research presented in the PBS series. Life energy, consciousness, possibly afterlife. So many people have had life after death experiences that and see, quantum physics is supporting a more mysterious and comprehensive range of possibilities. Wow, so we have quite a diversity of views here. Okay, at this point, I'm going to ask you to stop posting, but I have an even more intriguing question for you. Some of you talked about personal experiences. What I'd like to do now, we're really short and tight on time today, but those of you who've had a personal experience who would care to share with the rest of us that experience, even 1 minute or 2 minutes, can you please go and do the function, the electronic raise hand function? I think normally you go to reactions on the bottom right of your screen, and there should be a raised hand there. If you can't find it there, go to participants, it might be there, or as a fallback, if you have a PC, click Alt-Y, and a Mac, Option and Y. You got that? So under reactions or participants, look for raised hands. And if not, then PCs, Alt Y, and Max Option Y. And I'm going to ask Loretta, you've been helping us. Can you see if anyone has raised their hands?
Yes, Deborah Peck has, and I can unmute her.
Okay, thank you very much. Deborah, can you share just in 1 or 2 minutes, what was your experience that leads you to believe in consciousness could persist after death? As soon as you're unmuted.
Deb, you'll need to unmute yourself. For some reason, the toggle isn't working.
This was an experience with a friend who was in hospice care, and I happened to be with him when he died. And that night, he appeared to me in a dream.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, my goodness, Ted, you died. You're not here anymore. It was a welcoming experience, not a scary experience, but I've carried it with me.
Thank you, Deb.
Thank you. If you could mute, and then Marlene Finch is also, if you could unmute yourself.
Hi. So my experience happened when I was a child, and I didn't know what it was called. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I read a book, and the book explained near-death experience. The feeling was of incredible light that you cannot imagine and love.
Wow.
Thank you. And if you can mute yourself again, and the third person we'll take and last is Hollabuck.
Hala, could you unmute yourself, please, first? Unmute Hala at the bottom left of your screen.
Okay. All right. I wrote about this experience in my book. My father was dying, and he had hospice there, and I just left for a few minutes, and he died while I was out of the room. And when I came back, I just saw his body, and I knew that, you know, what keeps us, what is consciousness is not in the body. It's not in some brain waves. It's something that I couldn't really describe. And the next day, or that evening, I can't remember, had a lucid dream, and I felt really guilty. And I had a lucid dream of him saying, you know, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. And he said, I have something for you. And he went down into a cellar, which in psychology is like going into the unconscious, and then coming back in and giving me a plant. And he said, life goes on, and I love you.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Hala, and also Marlene and Deborah. Folks, now let's turn back to Geoff and ask Geoff, you've done extensive research on this subject, Geoff. What have you found out about near-death experiences?
Well, I am not a scientific researcher. I've read the stuff. I've met some of the people that have had, and I've really kind of immersed in it. But all I can do is report what I've learned. But I'm going to go back to the spring of '67 when my young family and I drove down from New England to visit Washington, D.C. And high on our to-do list was to go to Arlington Cemetery, where my wife's dad was buried there after his death in a World War II plane crash. And after our visit, someone asked our youngest, Louisa, age 4, what she thought after seeing Grandpa Bert's grave. And she paused for a moment, and then she said, he's dead, dead, dead. And that became our family term for anything that's ended, done with, finished, over completely, irretrievably gone. It's dead, dead, dead. And that's what death meant to me, and sounds like quite a few people in our Zoom audience too. So I got involved in this subject when my view was challenged 8 years later by a book called Life After Life by Raymond Moody. He was a psychiatric intern, but he described amazing experiences from over 100 patients and colleagues that he labeled near-death experience, NDEs for short. Now, while each one was unique, they shared many elements that occurred while a patient was unconscious. Having an out-of-body experience, we've heard that, seeing one's physical body and surroundings and hearing voices of people, all from some vantage point above, feeling mentally sharp, floating through a dark place or tunnel, emerging into a strange other world with a different sense of time and space, experiencing a being of intense light that exudes love and caring, enduring a life review in moments with details of one's life and its impact on others that could feel painful, meeting dead family members, realizing with regret that one must return to this world, and finally rejoining one's physical body, often a jolting and painful experience. Life After Life inspired countless articles, TV shows, movies that made these elements familiar. One of them, and at the same time, it inspired a new field of science. And one of these young scientists, a young psychiatrist named Bruce Grayson, devised a scale that allows researchers to standardize and classify NDEs on the basis of the number and depth of the elements they experience. And if the score reached a certain numerical threshold, the experience is labeled as an NDE.
Geoff, you're on mute.
You muted yourself and I can't see your mute button.
If is all of that been totally gone? Oh dear, I'm so sorry.
No, just the last sentence. So just
Oh.
back up
Oh.
one sentence.
Okay, no idea how that happened. Anyhow, did you hear the business about the scale and Gallup poll? Anyhow, just quickly to repeat, Bruce Grayson, a young scientist who was inspired by the Life After Life publication, devised a scale for trying to classify NDEs that had a minimum threshold. And if the number and depth of experiences exceeded that minimum scale, it's classified as an NDEs. And Gallup, using this scale in 1982, his poll estimated about 4% of the US population had experienced at least one NDE. And we've seen today that given how many people we have, the statistics sound reasonable. More recent estimates suggest the percentage could be higher. Whatever the percentage, literally millions have had an NDE. And though the term was new, NDEs are doubtless as old as humans, as a species. Accounts go back in various cultures. Famous persons who've had NDEs include Queen Victoria, Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman. And today, modern methods of resuscitation since the late 60s have made NDEs more likely than in the past. And they can happen to anyone regardless of age, sex, religious beliefs, or lack thereof. Both atheists and fundamentalist Christians have NDEs. Not all are physical, as with cardiac arrest, but believing that you're about to die and other mental crises can launch an NDE. Whatever the cause, an NDE is likely the most important, most intense experience of one's life. NDEers can remember vividly every detail, even decades later, and it leaves them profoundly changed. Nearly all NDEers report a strong decrease or complete loss of fear of death. They become more compassionate, often taking up professions that focus on helping others. And despite their new and strengthened belief in an afterlife, most seem to cherish this life more deeply and believe in making a difference here and now. Post-NDE life is not easy, however. NDEers often find their relationships with families, friends, and colleagues worsen. Divorce is more common. As a result, though NDEers show no signs of mental illness either before or after an NDE, they often need counseling. Sadly, they often find that neither the medical nor religious professionals are of much help. Now, despite all this, most scientists, especially in neuroscience or related disciplines like psychiatry, psychology, or philosophy of mind, find the claims of NDEers hard to accept. And I think there's some in our Zoom audience. The establishment view, that of most scientists, at least in their day jobs, is materialism. And it comes in different flavors and styles, but its roots go back to the Enlightenment and even earlier to the 17th century in the time of Galileo and Newton. And this paradigm says that we live only in a material world, the natural world with physical causes for all that happens. The supernatural world, real to scientists then, but doubtful now, should be left to religion and the institutions that practice it. Real knowledge of our world comes only from physically observable data through our 5 senses. Now, since NDEs are impossible under this paradigm, most materialist scientists simply ignore them. Some do accept the fact of NDEs, but seek a natural, meaning a materialist, as against a supernatural, meaning non-materialist explanation. And over the years, these scientists have come up with many explanations, over 20 by some counts. Some are physiological, like oxygen deprivation, excess of carbon dioxide, epileptic seizures in the parietal lobe. Some are psychological, such as expectations, wishful thinking, or mental illness. And some may be plausible in individual cases, but none really begin to explain all the NDEs. Some of you may have read an article in The Atlantic a few years ago by the late Dr. Oliver Sacks, best-selling author and professor of neurology at NYU School of Medicine. In his article, Seeing God in the Third Millennium, How the Brain Creates Out-of-Body Experiences and Religious Epiphanies, Sacks excoriates Harvard Medical School neurosurgeon Eben Alexander, and probably some of you have heard of him. He had recently published an account of his NDE and claimed it couldn't have come from a natural cause from his brain because his brain wasn't functioning. Sacks countered that it must have occurred while regaining consciousness and therefore was produced by the brain. Sacks finishes with this admonition: to deny the possibility of any natural, meaning materialist, explanation for an NDE is more than unscientific, it is anti-scientific. Taboo. Now, this attitude is widely shared. Young scientists can jeopardize their careers if they even show interest in the paranormal or transcendent. Grants for research are difficult to find. I know of one scientist with excellent credentials who decided 2 years ago to fund her small but paradigm-challenging research project by crowdsourcing. Fortunately, it worked. Some people, at least, if not the establishment, think these topics are important. Now, despite the challenges to would-be researchers, an institution focused solely on afterlife science thrives within a 2.5-hour drive of River Road, depending on traffic, of course. Its focus, according to its website, and I'll just read here, is phenomena related to consciousness clearly functioning beyond the confines of the physical body, as well as phenomena that are directly suggestive of post-mortem survival of consciousness. Taboo, taboo. The Department of Perceptual Services at the University of Virginia Health Services, DOPS, D-O-P-S for short, has functioned for more than 50 years, funded with a generous private grant. Bruce Grayson, the psychiatrist that pioneered NDE research, makes DOPS his academic home. He and DOPS feature in 2 episodes of the new Netflix documentary. The scientists there are part of a growing band that call themselves post-materialist scientists. Grayson, who has personally interviewed more than 1,000 NDEers, is well aware of materialist criticisms and alternate explanations, but he finds 6 aspects of the NDE experience hard to explain within the materialist natural world. 1, unusual clarity and speed of thought. This is reported by 80% of NDEers. It's not what you would expect from a groggy brain or one starved from oxygen. 2, timelessness. 75% say that time changed for them, more than 50% that it disappeared entirely. 3, vivid senses. About 2/3 report colors never seen before, sounds never heard, once in a while even new smells. Detailed life review, we've all heard about that. About 25% of NDEers report this. Most say these memories are vivid, and they can fully re-experience their emotions. And more than half of those experience the sensations and emotions of the persons they affected. 5, accurate vision and hearing during an out-of-body experience. Now, where NDEers' accounts could be independently checked, researchers have found that 92% were completely accurate, 6% partly right, but with some inaccuracies, only 1% were wrong. Finally, number 6 on Bruce Grayson's list. NDEers often report meeting dead relatives. Skeptics who scorn the otherworldly aspect of NDEs dismiss such reports as wishful thinking. And this is called the expectation hypothesis. The idea is that you, the NDEer, in your hallucinatory state, believing that you have survived death, would expect to see dead relatives and others with an emotional bond. This doesn't explain the following case from South Africa that Grayson personally researched, however. In this NDE, and there are others like it, the NDEer could not have expected that the person they met was dead. And here's his description from a 28 public symposium in Charlottesville, and I'll just read it. Quote, Jack was a 27-year-old electrical engineer who was hospitalized with pneumonia. One day, as his young nurse, Anita, was fluffing up his pillow, she mentioned to him that this weekend was going to be her 25th birthday, and she was going to be gone a few days visiting her parents. Shortly after she left, Jack's condition went downhill and he had trouble breathing, and he eventually stopped breathing entirely. He then had a near-death experience in which he saw Nurse Anita. Surprised to see her there, he said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "I've come to fluff your pillow up one more time, and I'd like you to go back and tell my parents that I love them, and I'm sorry I wrecked the red sports car." When Jack recovered, he told the nurse about this experience. She started to tear up and left the room immediately. Later, Jack learned that Anita's parents had in fact surprised her with a red sports car for her birthday, and excited to try it out, she raced down the highway, crashed into a concrete barrier, dying instantly. How could Jack have done this? Well, that ends the planned remarks for our NDE section. I'll turn back to Jon.
Well, thank you, Geoff. So we've covered near-death experiences. Let's talk now about 2 other phenomenon that might shed some light into the afterlife. Both of these phenomena are controversial, and both have drawn criticism or laughs or both. We're talking about mediums, that is, people who claim they can communicate with the departed, and also people, especially young children, who somehow have memories of past lives. So before we hear from Geoff on that subject, let's get your take, at least on the subject of mediums. I'd like to run one more poll. And now, for the first time in River Road, let's see what we think about mediums. And the poll question is, some mediums are authentic and have actually made contact with people who have died. How do you come out on that, folks? Give it 5 more seconds. Okay, so what are our results? Wow, so it looks like, Geoff, it looks like 51% of us either disagree or strongly disagree that some mediums can be authentic. We've got a lot of neutral folks, 17%, and 32% are more open to this. So we have quite a divided audience with a lot of skepticism. So let's, Geoff, let's now hear from you. What have you learned from your study about mediums and also about children, people, including children, who claim that they have experienced past lives?
Well, thanks, Jon. Yeah, interesting results. Very, very divided group here. Well, many skeptics reject the survival value of NDE evidence. Excuse me, I'm going to knock off this pole here so I can see what's happening. Reject the survival value of NDE evidence because it comes from people that are not now dead. This criticism doesn't apply for our next subject, mediums. The source of their evidence is people who died and stayed dead. And mediums do claim to communicate with the dead. Not a claim our modern culture takes seriously, as we have seen, and one that's often ridiculed. And indeed, many mediums are frauds, yet scientists, some with Nobel Awards, have investigated mediums for nearly 140 years, going back to London in the 1880s. They controlled for fraud and found many mediums to be genuine and occasionally astonishing. And mediums are not ridiculed by people who have had a sitting with an ethical, talented medium. And I'd like to give you an example from investigative reporter Leslie Kean's 2017 book, Surviving Death. And this is the book on which the Netflix series is based. Now, as part of her research, Kean wanted the experience of sitting with a medium. She had recently lost two people close to her, a younger brother named Lloyd and an older man, Bud Hopkins, who was a professional colleague and close friend. And though skeptical, Kean wanted to try to contact them. And so she decided on two independent sittings and identified two well-recommended mediums, Laura Lynn Jackson from New York and Sandra O'Hara, living outside Dublin in Ireland. The sittings were arranged under false names and done over telephone. And the way these sittings work is that the medium, after getting into a receptive mental state, then tells the sitter, Kean in this instance, what she's receiving, and then asks simple questions such as, does that make sense? And the sitter is expected to answer only yes or no. Kean devotes a whole chapter each to these two readings. The experience deeply moved her. And what impressed her is that in addition to telling accurate personal details about her two contacts, both mediums in their own styles captured the very different feel of the two personalities. One, her friend who was assertive and outgoing. The other, her brother who was shy and retiring. Now, Sandra O'Hara and Laura Lynn Jackson work as mental mediums, a term applied when the mediums remain conscious while in communication with a discarnate, the spiritual entity. There are also trance mediums and though very rare, physical mediums, and we're not going to talk about them today. Most mediums today practice as mental mediums, especially when before groups. And for them, this process may include something like seeing images, hearing voices, or just through intuition, just knowing. Laura Lynn Jackson describes it as like a game of psychic charades. Mental mediums do sometimes work as ordinary psychics, receiving information in paranormal ways, such as by telepathy, reading minds, or clairvoyance, also known as remote viewing. Mediums know the difference, however. They report higher energy levels when they act as mediums. And one medium explained the difference this way. A psychic reading is like reading a book. A mediumship reading is like seeing a play. So if you've lost a close relative, a parent, or worse, a child, you might want to go to a medium. If so, how would you find someone that can convince you that she or he isn't just skilled at reading body language and feeding back generalities that you in your grief might interpret as actual contact? In other words, a fraud. Well, the Windbridge Institute in Arizona has pioneered a way of testing mediums that tries to establish their credibility. Dr. Julie Beischel, who co-founded Windbridge in 2008, holds a PhD in pharmacology and toxicology. A doubting scientist, she grudgingly agreed to see a medium after her mother died and was blown away. The experience not only helped with her grief, it changed her career. She went into afterlife science focused on mediums. Beischel has adapted techniques for evaluating drugs to evaluating mediums, and they include both blind testing and controls. Neither the medium nor the sitter are in contact. The medium knows only the sitter's first name. The full testing program requires a couple of weeks. Windbridge doesn't charge for the testing, but applicants If they complete the program satisfactorily, commit a few hours every month for research projects, and are certified as research mediums. The Forever Family Foundation, which is featured in the Netflix series, has a comparable program. Both institutions list the mediums they have certified on their websites. Now, other institutions do a different type of research. At DOPS, scientists are using the state-of-the-art EEG, electroencephalogram facility there to study altered states of consciousness in trance mediums. And the Institute of Noetic Sciences, located near San Francisco, works with mental mediums in its EEG lab as part of its long-term program of consciousness research. A recent study showed that when professional mediums are in communication with discarnates, their brain states are unique. They differ from when the medium is just making stuff up or remembering things or just taking information in. And the article about their research was published in 2013 in the journal Frontiers of Psychology and was among the 1% most viewed that year. Professional mediums insist that you don't really need them to be in touch with your dead loved ones, however. Surveys by Gallups and others have shown that 30 to 40% of us indeed believe that we have had communications from the other side. If any of you have sat at the bedside of a dying relative, and we've already heard of that earlier, you may have witnessed an important example called deathbed visions or end-of-life apparitions. They usually begin a few weeks before a patient passes. Patients appear to perceive these spiritual visitors that you can't see, whom they happily recognize as relatives who have died. Research, some shown on the Netflix series, documents this. In a few cases, bedside nurses and family members who are with patients at their final moments have themselves had an NDE-like experience that includes a shared view of the apparitions and other paranormal features. Dr. Raymond Moody describes such cases in a recent book, labeling them shared death experiences. Since they include obviously healthy people, they challenge skeptics who claim that deathbed visions are just hallucinations of a dying brain. We're going to move to the final topic, reincarnation. We all know the term, but as with mediums, it's not an idea our culture takes seriously. Our view of reincarnation got a jolt more than 60 years ago when the media learned of a young Denver businessman and amateur hypnotist, Maury Bernstein. He took a woman he had hypnotized back to her earliest childhood. He regressed her. When, to his amazement, she began to speak in a thick Irish brogue and claimed to be a woman named Bridie Murphy, born in County Cork, Ireland in 1798. Details of her life later emerged, including her death in 1856. And this case led to the 1956 movie, The Search for Bridie Murphy. Now, hypnotic regression that leads to a past life experience is used today by some doctors in their practice. I personally believe the Bridie Murphy case to be genuine, but most scientists in this field don't consider hypnotic regression to be reliable. About the time of the movie, however, a different type of inquiry was launched that has received little publicity, but provides better evidence. It's called Children Who Remember Past Lives. And here's an example from a recent case. Now read here. Doreen, a mother living in New York City, had just warned her lively 3-year-old William that he might get a spanking when he responded, "Mom, when you were a little girl and I was your daddy, you were bad a lot of times and I never hit you." Whoa, how do you respond to your 3-year-old when he says that? Well, Doreen was shocked. William continued to talk on many occasions about being his grandfather. He knew things that he couldn't otherwise have picked up, like the nickname her dad used for a family cat and the exact day when he, as his mom's dad, died. Other aspects made his return as William believable. Doreen's dad had said in his next life he would take care of animals. William said he would be an animal doctor and would take care of large animals at a zoo. Most telling evidence relates to the fatal wound Doreen's dad received. While trying as a security guard to prevent a robbery, he was hit by a bullet in his pulmonary artery. That's the artery that carries blood with oxygen from the heart to the lungs. William was born with a defect that seemed to match that fatal wound. Called pulmonary valve atresia, it's a condition in which an inadequately formed valve of the main pulmonary artery prevents blood from traveling to the lungs, exactly matching his granddad's wound. This case was investigated by Dr. Jim Tucker, a child psychiatrist who heads DOPS and is now the leading authority in this field. His mentor, Dr. Ian Stevenson, investigated the first cases in the late 1950s in India, Ceylon, and Thailand. He established rigorous procedures to rule out alternative explanations, much like a competent police murder investigation. By the mid-60s, when the case volume had grown to over 600, Stevenson founded DOPS to devote full time to this phenomenon. Now, more than 12 years after his death, researchers have collected about 2,500 cases. While they seem more likely in cultures with a belief in reincarnation, cases have been found worldwide, including in the US and Europe. Two recent cases featured in the last episode of the Netflix series. In one of these cases, a young boy from Louisiana had past life memories of being a World War II pilot. In the other, a young Oklahoma boy remembers a previous life as a dance teacher, talent agent, and an extra in a Hollywood movie. How about that? And these cases share a number of features. Previous life statements usually begin at age 2 or 3, about the time they begin to talk, tend to end by 6 or 7. They occur spontaneously, not from hypnosis. The lives described are mostly recent. The median interval between the previous death and the child's birth is only 16 months. In about 70% of the cases, the previous death remembered was by unnatural means, like murder. In many cases, investigators have identified a deceased person who appears to match the child's report. Many children, as in the case of William, have birthmarks that match wounds suffered by the previous personality. Like William, children act in ways that seem to link to their previous lives. When they report past lives as a member of the opposite sex, and this happens in about 10% of the cases, their behavior, sometimes extreme, seems more appropriate for the opposite sex. Now, the events children discuss usually happened at the end of life. About 3/4 tell about their previous death, and 20% describe events between lives, such as attending their own funeral. In a few cases, like with NDEs, children describe moving on to other realms where they encounter spiritual beings. How has the scientific establishment dealt with this field? Well, most have ignored it. However, the late Carl Sagan, who refused Dr. Stevenson's work, did note in his last book, the field deserved serious study. Anyhow, that ends my planned remarks. Back to you, Jon.
Well, thank you, Geoff. So folks, with your help, Geoff has already covered 3 phenomenon that might offer us some clues about what happens to consciousness after death: near-death experiences, mediums, and memories of past lives. Now let's go back over to you, and we'd like to hear your comments and any questions that you have for Geoff. What we prefer is for you to go back into the chat function and type any comments and questions there. And Loretta, I'll ask you if you could help once again, this time reading out any comments and also reading to Geoff any questions. For those of you who do want to speak, if we have time, we will get to you. For that, you need to raise your hand electronically by going usually to reactions or sometimes participants and clicking on the raised hand function. And if that doesn't work for you, if you have a PC, click Alt-Y, and a Mac, Option Y. Okay, so go to the chat function to give a comment or question to Geoff, which Loretta will read out. And if you prefer to speak, we'll get to you afterwards if you go and raise your hand automatically. So Loretta.
Yes, I'm here. I don't see any raised hands at the moment.
Okay, let's see what's going on in the chat function. Do you see any comments or questions that you'd like to share with the rest of the group?
how near the near death has to be. So I would gather that this person is asking
Oh, yeah.
how close to the time of death does a near death experience have to be to qualify as a near death experience?
Well, I think the first of all, the near death experiences do happen to people who are not actually near death, but they may think they're near death, or they have some sort of a personal crisis. But whether it's an NDE or not is then judged basis on the number of different elements. We went over them at the beginning, that an out-of-body experience, feeling mentally very sharp, passing through a tunnel, going to the other side, but during the out-of-body experience, being able to see stuff that's happening on, in some cases, that's what they see is verified independently. So, but they can happen really at any time, and not just as you're approaching death. Yep.
Another question? Go ahead. You can read it. Go ahead.
Can you link your findings to quantum theory?
That's probably above my pay grade, but I think what the non-material side would say, that quantum theory does not say no. Whereas before that, a lot of people could see it's impossible under current theory. Quantum theory begins to open up the possibility. I don't know if any of you saw the recent, about 2 years ago, a NOVA account of, essentially it was about the quantum phenomena, entangled particles, and in that it showed that at least in some sense, if you have entangled particles, they do indeed can affect one another beyond the speed of light, so to speak. So that and at the very end of it, the dean of the Advanced Institute speculates on this and says, we've got to think about a totally different way of looking at the universe, which might be holographic, and that ultimately the ultimate reality may be more probabilities than something that's material. But I defer to people who know quantum theory better than I do on that.
Loretta, any other questions you'd like to extract from there?
The novelist Michael Crichton explored the afterlife. Have you read his book Travels?
I have not. I would love to. Tell us about it.
Yeah, that was from one participant. So that sounds like a book that might be worth exploring.
Yes, this was an autobiographical book, but he was very fascinated by all of these phenomenon and did a lot of study of near-death experience and also of mediums and things like that. On the whole, I think he was a believer, but he writes about it in a very engaging, fascinating way.
Thank you. That sounds like it would be something interesting to read.
Geoff, how can we talk about consciousness when we can't even define it?
Well, that's a good question. 40 years ago, nobody was even studying it. It's increasingly being a subject of study. But yeah, we talk about dark matter and dark energy, and I think part of the problem is that it's the first person subjective experience that we're talking about when we're talking about consciousness, the awareness, and intrinsically, it's very hard to communicate in a way that is 100% meaningful when it's a personal subjective experience. And that's essentially what consciousness is.
Another question from the chat. In the realm of reincarnation conversations, does the soul trigger any specific comments? As we know, soul does go back to the Greek and Hindu philosophers.
Well, soul is a tough term. It has so many kind of religious overtones, but so sometimes soul is thought of as the equivalent of personal consciousness. There's the, and that that moves on to the other side. The personal consciousness, the soul, if you will, retains some characteristics, some capabilities, memories, quite a number of things that are acquired in this life. And at the same time, again, if you believe in past lives, also is at that point able to remember some other things. So, but you know, it's not a technically defined term. Obviously, it's a religion. I prefer just awareness or consciousness as a term that survives.
Geoff, I see one person said most of what I heard could be explained by telepathy. How would you react to that?
Well, I would say that is in a way true. That's called the super Psy hypothesis. Psy, not SIG, but PSI. And the idea is that indeed mediums, when they're doing this, are in fact reading the minds of the people whom they may not see or know, maybe doing research in libraries, doing a whole bunch of occasionally incredible things, but coming up with all of this and is not actually in touch with somebody on the other side. This is very much the position, I think, of Stephen Broad. And you can't, logically, you can't dismiss it. Just for me, and I think for most people, it's anybody that has the powers, the super Psy powers, it's more believable to me that there's another side that consciousness goes to rather than it's this side.
Geoff, I see a couple of comments of experiences here. I wanted to share them with you. One was, when our son was a toddler learning language, I heard him several times in his sleep doing what I could only call speaking in tongues. It was clearly a language, but I couldn't recognize it and was struck by it. Another person says, my grandmother's near-death experiences were totally life-changing for her in a good way. Another person mentions about her mother when she was dying, looking at the ceiling and talking to her dead sister.
Wow.
And I think there was one other provocative comment or question, which I'll get to. Someone says, recently, very controlled studies in Europe and the US have controlled documentation of NDEs.
Yeah, that's probably Dr. Pim van Lommel, who's a Dutch surgeon who's done a lot of work on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are amazing. Yeah, gosh, love to hear more about those. Yeah.
Someone wants to know why NDEers would have a harder time after their NDE experience.
Well, that's a good question. I think what NDEers say is that they're changed, and the people that they return to aren't changed, and so this requires some adjustment, and it's not always an easy adjustment, particularly if the in some cases somebody who's had an NDE, or you know, has maybe they were a Wall Street banker or something like that, and they want to go and be a teacher in the in the inner city or something like that. Whoa, that's going to have some impact on everybody. So it's hard, but so yeah, it happens a lot, and the divorce rate is definitely higher.
Wow. Geoff, I understand that along with the chat questions, we have 3 people who are raising their hands. Carl.
And we will call on those now. In series, there are 3 raised hands, and we'll call a name, and you can unmute yourself if you will.
Pat Wan, will you go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hi, I had a direct it felt like communication with my daughter after she had been dead for 11 months. She died as a young woman, 33 years old, and I was distraught in tears every day. And I was very interested in finding out if she and I had had past lives relationships. So I was put in touch with someone who might be able to help me explore my own past life. And when I reached this woman via phone, she had never seen me, and I simply said, I need to find out about how my relationship with my daughter pre-existed, because I feel we have a very special connection that was beyond the life of just the two of us. And the medium began to say, did your daughter die of breast cancer? I had not said anything about that. And I was aghast, and I said, yes. I said, how do you know? And she said, she's appearing to me now. Was it on her right side? And the conversation went from there. I heard messages from my daughter. The bottom line was, Mom, what happened had to happen. You have to stop crying. I have done what I could do, and it's time for you to live your life. This went on for 45 minutes. When we hung up the phone, the medium said to me, now I recommend, she said, this was late at night by the time I reached her. She said, I recommend, I'm very sorry, I did not turn on the tape recorder when this started. This, by the way, happened 16 years ago. And she said, but I want you to start taking notes of everything you remember about this conversation. I will do the same. And please give me your email address and I will send you my notes. So that is the end of the communication I had with the medium. But believe me, it changed my life. I knew in the conversation of that 40 minutes that I would stop crying, and which I do most of the time now, and that I had heard from Marjorie. It was clearly her. And because the notes indicated, the medium told me in her email, she said, I kept getting more messages after we hung up. And among them and they were messages that related to our family life, that related to my daughter and her husband's relationship. There were all kinds of things that I didn't say to the medium.
Wow, that's powerful.
Very much. Did you want to respond? Either of you want to respond? And then we have a few more raised hands. It's at this point, it's an hour into the session. Do you want to take more questions?
Oh, absolutely. That my comment is that that's really powerful. I'm just blown away.
Needless to say, it certainly changed my life.
Loretta, why don't we take a few more questions and then we'll close out.
Okay, so
we need to leave. It is 1 hour, and you're,
yeah.
of course, you may.
Okay, so we have one from Chris Hager. Chris, if you could unmute yourself, and we'll try to spotlight you.
Sure. I just have a comment. When my mother died when my nephew was only 3, and he doesn't remember this at all. But a few months after she died, she'd had a stroke. She'd had cancer. She couldn't walk anymore. A few months after she died, he had a dream in which she was walking. And I always took that as his being able to process her death, and that she had visited him in his unconscious mind, and was a guide to tell him that she was fine. He said, he told my brother, Formore, that was the name of my grandmother, my mother, my father's mother in Swedish, that she was walking again, and she had just called to say, she just visited to say goodbye. And again, I think that's a way that we process death. We who are living and conscious are processing a death.
Thank you.
Thank you. Candace Riddington, could you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
And I'm kind of, as a retired scientist, I'm kind of bowled over by some of the stories, not so much the near-death stuff, because I think that happens. Even my intern has said that his patients have died. They've experienced near-death experiences. But in terms of the medium, the one with the daughter who had cancer was, quite, very surprising, unexplainable to me as a scientist. But I would like, in terms of mediums, I would like a study in which a group of people want to see a medium. They're all assembled, they with all the criteria that you've talked about, and the same medium has to talk to all the people in a series of events, so that there's statistics on whether they can actually contact people, a number of people in one session.
Okay, thank you. And that was Jack Leibowitz. Sorry about the computer name on there. That concludes the raised hands. We do have a few more chat comments or questions. You want to go to those? Okay, can we thank our speakers, because I think people are starting to leave. So thank you very much for doing this, and we'll conclude with a few more from the chat.
Loretta, will you read out some of the chat ones for those who want to stay on?
This is the first time, hang on. This is the first time I've ever heard that people who recall past lives may also have physical indications of the person they were in a past life. How common is this?
Dr. Stevenson, he only wrote 2 books. He did a lot of articles, but his last book is called Where Biology and Reincarnation Intersect. And it's all about this phenomenon. It's actually surprisingly common. I can't give you a percentage, but it's not rare.
What was the name of that book?
It's called Where Biology and Reincarnation Intersect. It's by Dr. Ian Stevenson. It was published in the late 90s, I think. He died about 12 years ago, but it was published 10 years before that.
And then another comment from someone in the chat. I've had an out-of-body experience while meditating. With my eyes closed, I rose to the ceiling, looking down at my own body, sitting there meditating. The sensation was of being a helium balloon bouncing gently at the ceiling. When the thought came, OMG, I'm having an out-of-body experience, and instantly zipped back to my body, sitting and meditating quietly.
Wow, I've heard that from other meditators. I envy you. I wish my meditations did that. Yeah.
And Jeff and I do meditations in our River Road men's group, but never have I heard a fellow men's group member say we've had that experience. Loretta, are there any other chats? Otherwise, I'll be inclined to do a closeout shortly.
Just people asking for notes and bibliography. So just so you know, we will post, I have a Facebook group for Contemporary Issues Forum. So I will post the recording there. If you want to make any comments in that group, we can send you the emails for the speakers or what have you. Okay, thank you very much. And thanks again to our speakers. This was a marvelous.
Thank you, Loretta.
presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, and folks, come back on March 14th. Come back on March 14th to learn about how Montgomery County and Maryland deal with hate and bias incidents. Look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you for joining us and your strong participation.
Thank you. It was great.
Hi, John.
Okay. Okay, John, I guess we'll talk later then. Great. Great job.
How about if I
We
send you?
can stay on
all-
a few minutes if you wish.
Yeah, and I can email you if assuming the volume isn't too large, I can email you the recording and you can take a look at it before I post.
Oh, Loretta, is that then what a recording is? Just the audio, or is it video as well?
It's
Okay,
video as
that you
well.
won't be able to email, I'm absolutely sure. It would have to be uploaded to the site. It's just too large. Now, there are other ways like Dropbox